This is a typical crack that occurs as a result of the high, dry weather, and these little flags that you see here delineate the beginning and the end of a crack, and then you see some more along the top of a levee. These are examples of slides that have occurred, and in this particular case, these are underneath the I-30 bridge crossing the river. Quite frankly, these have a relatively simple fix. Two things. Number one, there's water that stormwater that currently accumulates and comes down at a single point, high volume, high velocity, causing the rutting. We need to collect that water, provide for a different mechanism to bring it down into the river, and then obviously we need to provide protection to these embankments to prevent that kind of erosion in the future. Here I've only shown you pictures of the vegetation challenge that pertains to trees. In both cases, these trees are in close proximity to the levees. The core policy requires that trees be greater than 50 feet away from the total levee. These are examples of silt built up along some of the channels. Obviously, all the flow that comes into our sumps, into our pump stations, brings with it silt, and it will accumulate, and those are things that need to be maintained. Here's an example of channel bank instability. In fact, in this picture, you see both examples. Here's a bank that is in what would appear to be relatively good shape with grass growing on it, appears to be stable. Here's an area that has sloughed off. Likewise, here's an area where we've lost a little bit of the embankment, and so those are other areas that need to be addressed. The items that are rated unacceptable in this inspection report need to be addressed through a combination of the following methods, and there's 4 methods specifically that are outlined in page 24. First and foremost, there's ongoing operations and maintenance. The city's street services department, through its flood control activities, spends about $7.5 million on an annual basis operating and maintaining all of the facilities associated with the floodway, and some of these things, in fact, we have already corrected or are in the process of corrected through our normal operating and maintenance activities. There are some major maintenance items that are beyond the scope of that which we fund and, quite frankly, beyond our means, both financially and physically, with regards to what our street department does. There is the implementation of the flood control elements of the Trinity River Project Corridor, which, as I've indicated to you before, will in fact address some of the major deficiencies, particularly associated with the elevation of the levees and the stability, the slope of the levees. However, I must also share with you that some of the findings in this inspection report present us with a challenge that require additional engineering analysis, the identification of strategies and recommendations to move forward as to how we address those. An example of one of those, quite frankly, is the desiccation cracking. We all recognize it as being a challenge, but I'm not sure that we know what is the proper strategy to utilize to either control, prevent, manage that situation. It is also important to note that there are a number of other agencies that own some of the facilities that have been identified in this inspection report as having deficiencies. They include the bridges that both the Texas Department of Transportation and DART, as well as Union Pacific Railroad, have across our levees. The Dallas County Jail, which is nearing completion, is also identified as a challenge because the basement of the facility, the building itself and the basement of the facility, is in very close proximity to the toe of the levee and extends, if you will, into the extension of the levee underneath the ground elevation. I mentioned the power lines and the Encore facilities. There are a number of utilities, both city-owned as well as other private utilities, that have a number of penetrations across and through the levees, and they will need to be involved in addressing the issues. I mentioned earlier that the city has already begun the process to address some of the unacceptable and minimally acceptable items in the report. To date, you'll see that in Appendix A and B of the presentation you've been given, there's some 35 items that have either been corrected or at least temporarily addressed until we can find a permanent solution. Again, I've indicated that the implementation of the Trinity Corridor project will address some of the issues. Some of the issues will require additional engineering services, and we will be bringing forward to you contracts to help us identify those solutions and define and design for us those fixes. If you don't mind, Kelly, I'd back up because this is an important one. The last item on this last page, I mentioned to you earlier that it is our belief, there is no doubt in our mind that our current operating maintenance budget for levees in our current budget is insufficient. I'm going to cite a couple of examples of the kinds of things, of the new standards, if you will, that we are now facing that we will have to meet. I mentioned the challenges with vegetation, and it's not just about removing trees. It's about mowing on a much more frequent basis. Right now, on an annual basis, we budget sufficient to mow the entire 20-some-odd mile length levee system about 4 times a year. We believe that something like 10 to 12 cycles a year will be required. We believe that we're going to need to implement a vegetation management system in order to make sure that we have the kind of vegetation that is conducive toward a sound levee system and one that helps us in maintaining and operating. There's the issue with critters that we have living along the levees, which burrow holes into our levees. Well, we're going to have to implement a critter management process. And those are things that, quite frankly, those are but 2 examples, but those are, quite frankly, things that we don't currently fund. This is hard for you to read. I hope that you can read it in your report. What I'd like to spend a little time with you here on is talking to you about the performance of the levees. The levees have been in existence now for quite some time. In fact, ever since the Corps reconstructed them, which was completed in 1959, we now have about 50 years of life history of the levees. What I've shown in this slide 27 is the peak flows. One of the advantages we have is that we have the USGS that has stream flow gauges up and down the river, so we have good, accurate flow data, historical flow data on the river. And you can see here, beginning with the 1908, the big flood of 1908 that everybody who's from Dallas knows is the flood of record, and of course that occurred way before the levees were built. But then you see the other significant floods that have been experienced along the river. And I want to call your attention to this May 3rd, 1990 flood, which developed a peak flow, measured about 82,300 CFS at Commerce Street. And then, Kelly, if you'll go to the next slide.